One of the major things we see during this period of imperialism and the development of imperialism between 1857 and 1890 is the establishment and the development of so-called chartered companies. Now, this is a type of and a development of the British Empire and various other empires that we see in continuing fashion for a variety of, for a great period of time, in fact. But it's important that we spend a little bit of time talking about the chartered companies in this lesson. Forming part of the specification, as we can see here, the idea here is that we're going to focus a little bit more on trade and commerce in this lesson, looking at the nature of the chartered companies, looking at how they contributed to the trade and commerce of the British Empire in this period of time where we're talking about the development of imperialism. So this lesson specifically is going to examine the extent of industrialization, specifically, the impact that this has on the British Empire, in addition to looking at the chartered companies established during the empire itself. And so fundamentally then, when we think about trade and commerce, and we think about the development of trade and commerce within the British Empire, we have to then also think about what this had in terms of an impact over imperialism itself. The essential question that one might want to ask in relation to this particular area of history is relating to whether or not the developments in trade and commerce that we looked at in the previous lesson, whether or not this development in trade and commerce was good or whether or not it was actually bad for the empire itself. What kind of effect did it have on the empire? How do we measure whether or not it was good or bad? And to what extent does this have a broader impact on other parts of the British Empire itself? Now, the question of whether or not this was a good aspect of the empire, the development of trade and commerce, and the establishment of industrialization, whether or not this was good or bad, this impact is actually a matter of historical debate. Because on the one hand, you can make the conclusion, and you can come to the conclusion, that British capital and innovation did indeed modernize a number of undeveloped areas in the world. There was definitely a modernization process that took place. There was definitely the use of and the exportation of industrialization across the empire. This goes without saying. This is something that is undeniable. Okay, we can't analyze the empire without making reference to these underlying facts. However, you must also be aware of the fact that fundamentally this development was still nevertheless very heavily controlled by the British. And so there was, even though there was potentially this ability for British capital and innovation to modernize a number of undeveloped areas in the world, they still had very tight grips over the ways in which this modernization took place, and the impact of and the extent to which they had control over the profits from this modernization. And this turns our attention to the chartered companies. So the chartered companies were an integral part of the British Empire in terms of the ways in which they were able to organize under and within the empire itself. In 1881, for example, the North Borneo Trading Company received a charter for the purposes of administering the territory of North Borneo. This was one of the chartered companies that was established during this period. The charter itself would actually eventually set the precedent for subsequent charters that will be established in the future. This includes the Royal Niger Company, which was established in 1886, as well as the Imperial British East Africa Company, which is established in 1888, as well as the British South Africa Company, which is established in 1889. And this brings us towards the end of our period of examination, looking at the development of the British Empire from 1857 all the way to 1890. But it's just interesting here that these companies are established for the ways in which private capital is developed, and it is also more for the basic remnants and the basic factors of organization. The British Empire was a particularly large, complicated, and in some cases convoluted and difficult to understand part of the world. It was very, very huge. It had control over lots of areas, and so this sort of delegation of authority, the delegation of authority, the delegation of power away from all of these companies, away from the empire itself to these companies, meant that there was the ability for organization within the empire to take place in a way that was basically putting the administration roles into the private hands of these chartered companies. Now, we will come back to these chartered companies in future lessons' time and the impact that these chartered companies have, but fundamentally, as time goes on, we start to see a decline in the use of these chartered companies, and this can sort of be mapped onto some of the decline in the empire itself, but we have to first talk about the impact of the First World War, and then we'll look at the impact of the Second World War, and then we'll start talking about the process of decolonization in future lessons' time.